Hey, welcome to another episode of the Desk Response. Today I am again responding to Pranav Radhakrishnan of Science is Dope. We've already done a couple of responses calling out some of the pseudo-historical and pseudo-scientific claims that he's been pushing through his platform. And yes, you heard that right. So while he's calling out the pseudoscience in several other religions, he himself ironically has been abusing science recently to propagate his atheism. So this time we will be reacting to one such attempt to a response that he did to a reel that Justin Brierley had posted on his Instagram a while ago. So in the format of an Instagram reel, Justin has this light-hearted role play between a skeptic and a Christian, where the latter just addresses this popular and easily falsifiable notion that science leads to atheism. And guess what? Pranav was not impressed. And as we have shown in the last video as well, or the last response to him, you will see that here also there is a blatant rejection of the plain facts of history, some mental gymnastics and cognitive bias. So let's get into it. So Pranav begins by dismissing the concluding bit of Justin's reel, where he claims that Christian theology got the scientific revolution started. So what is Pranav's response to that? Let's listen.
Another DM on Instagram, this time Christian Fundamentalist, talking about how science is a result of Christianity. So let's watch the video.
So Justin claims that science is a result of Christianity. Pranav's response is that he is a Christian fundamentalist. So he begins by this ad hominem. Let's evaluate Justin's claim. Justin is merely quoting the consensus of modern historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science. Quite coincidentally, in a conversation that Justin himself moderated a few years ago between the noted philosopher of science Michael Roos and the Oxford mathematician John Lennox, Roos, a prominent atheist philosopher, says this.
Well, I think it has done in the past. Yes, first of all, I agree with John. I think that modern science owes a great... we want to say we've got to be broad and we've got to bring in Buddhism and all of these, but the simple fact of the matter is modern science owes basically its being to Christianity. I mean, at least the science that we have. And I'm sure we'll talk about Darwinism, and I would say it owes its being to Anglican Christianity. But certainly, I think that you're quite right to say that modern science owes its being to Christianity.
And Roos is not the only one. As I said, that's the academic consensus. In this massive academic volume published by Harvard University Press and edited by the atheist historian Ronald Numbers, the historian of science Noah Ephron writes, "Today, almost all historians agree that Christianity moved many early modern intellectuals to study nature systematically." He goes on to say that it was these Christian institutions, both Catholic and Protestant, and their ideas that gave rise to what in time came to be called as modern science. Now, this is not to say that the Bible explicitly teaches science. It is not a scientific textbook. Rather, certain fundamental aspects of Christian theology played an exclusive and crucial role in the development of Western science. The differentiating reason as to why science did not originate, say, in Arabia or in China or in India is Christian theology. Now, some of the doctrines that propelled science include the fall of man, the doctrine of creation, and the contingency of nature. Now, these are not the only Christian ideas that influenced the advent of modern science, but in this video, I will keep it to just three. So let's go over them one by one. The fall of man. The doctrine of the fallen nature of man through sin inspired the rise of experimental science. Let me explain. The belief that human intelligence and intuition is fallible and cannot be blindly trusted was crucial in the development of experiment-based inference through observations. The doctrine of the fall therefore influenced a departure from the Greek Aristotelian science, which, to use the words of the historian of science Peter Harrison, was based on a confidence in the unaided powers of human reason and senses. So in his much acclaimed book, The Fall of Man, man and the foundations of science, Harrison surveys the works of the founders of science and explores how their theological commitments fueled their scientific pursuits and broke away from the Greek ideas of human reason and knowledge. For instance, the Greeks shunned experiments and held that all knowledge could be derived through reason and intuition alone. And by the way, this is not just the ancient Greeks. It is also true of other pantheistic and polytheistic cultures of the day that elevated man to a status of being an enlightened entity or even a divine being. So for these cultures, human reason and intuition works perfectly. There is no need for experiments. One quick example would be, let's say, the rate of fall of two objects with different masses. So going by intuition, one might think that when you drop two objects, one much heavier, let's say 2 times heavier than the other, the heavier object would hit the ground first, right? Well, no. The Greeks also thought so by intuition, and they never bothered to test it out, and it was only during the medieval Christian era that this Aristotelian intuition was experimentally disproven and discarded. So in the Christian Europe, the natural theologians and pioneers of science developed what we now call the scientific method. State a hypothesis, set up experiments, observe the data, and draw the inference. Renowned classicist and historian Edwin Judge, who is arguably one of the leading scholars on the Greco-Roman era today, he writes, "The modern world is the product of a revolution in scientific method. Empiricism appeals not to logic, but to the testing by experiment of how things actually work. The experimental method is now indispensable to science." Now pay attention. Experiment in science arise from the worldview of Jerusalem, not Athens, from Jews and Christians, not the Greeks. So the Christian doctrine of the fall created the basis for experimental science. Second, the doctrine of creation. The belief that nature is an orderly creation of an intelligent and supreme mind inspired the early pioneers of science to study nature systematically. In fact, the reason why they used the word laws, like the laws of motion, laws of gravity, and so on, to describe scientific phenomena is because they believed in a lawgiver who created the universe with physical laws that governed them. Now, not just that. They were convinced that these laws can be stated through mathematical descriptions. And this is very, very important because we know that contributions to mathematics came from different geographies, including Greece, India, China, Arabia, and so on. But the thought that an omniscient mind created the universe and subjected it to natural laws that could be described through mathematics was a revolutionary product of Christian theology, and it gave rise to what we now call mathematical sciences. So when Isaac Newton, for instance, published his seminal work Principia Mathematica, it announced a departure from the Aristotelian philosophy that maintained a rigid boundary between the abstract realm of mathematics and the concrete physical realm. For Newton and the pioneers of science, applying math to the real world was a religious undertaking. The historian of mathematics Maurice Klein asserts the early mathematicians were sure of the existence of mathematical laws underlying natural phenomena and persisted in the search for them because they were convinced a priori that God had incorporated them in the construction of the universe. And this leads me to the third contributing belief to the advent of science, the contingency of nature. In Christian theological terms, contingency refers to the clear distinction between the creator and the created. Such a realization and belief was a huge impetus to science. It has to be noted that most ancient religions and cultures like Hinduism and the Greco-Roman religions, they all perceived nature to be divine. The doctrine can be summarized as God is everything and everything is God. Such nature worship discouraged the study of the physical realm, for these cultures were hesitant to subject their natural deities to human study. Now, the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation marked a clear distinction between the created and the creator, providing the right impetus for early scientific endeavors in medieval Europe. In fact, this idea of contingency even goes back to the very first page of the Bible. The author of Genesis challenged the cultural and theological notions of his day when he announced the transcendence of the Creator who exists necessarily and eternally and brought the universe and the natural entities into existence. And by the way, Moses was writing thousands of years before the advent of science. The cultures of that day were absolutely clueless about the natural entities that they saw in the outer space, and they thought of them as natural deities, the sun god, the moon god, the thunder god, and so on. So in stark and direct contrast to these beliefs, Genesis draws the distinction between the eternally existing Creator and the contingent creation. God created the sun, God created the moon, God created all the natural entities, even when those cultures could not understand what they were. The author of Genesis clearly advocated the contingency of nature. Edwin Judge, the historian that I quoted a while ago, writes on this account. He says, because of the Genesis doctrine of a contingent creation, Jewish philosophers like Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century and many Christian theologians who followed him could not accept an eternal universe, but insisted that it had a beginning and was changing and proceeding through history to its end. This is the insight that eventually led to the practical probing of the world we now recognize as empirical science. In fact, the early church fathers had taken the pantheistic view of an eternal divine cosmos head-on in the early centuries after Christ. And by the medieval era, Christian theology had created a culture that was conducive to the emergence of modern science. Now, all this is not to say that the Greeks or the other cultures did not contribute anything to human knowledge. They did. But it was the Christian convictions that purified even the Greek corpus of learning, detached it from faulty and even superstitious assumptions, refined it with the modern scientific method, which, as we discussed, was rooted in experimentation and verification, which in turn was rooted in certain Christian theological ideas.